Some 10 years ago, I stumbled on a black and white photograph of the extraordinary portrait you see here. I'd never come across anything quite like it. I felt that the portrait packed such a punch, it just really had a powerful effect on me. Long story cut short, the original proved untraceable and was presumed lost to the flames by its keepers. Nevertheless, all those years, the elusive portrait of this footless man kept haunting me. Then last year, out of the blue, an archivist who remembered my manic but fruitless search sent me a full-color image after having rediscovered the portrait during a massive restoration campaign. When Matthias Jacques walked back into my life, I was managing the design phase of an architectural master plan for the Antwerp Rubens House and Rubenianum. Universal design and accessibility issues have been very much part of that process, as I'm sure they have been to many of you who are involved in building or renovation projects. So in a way, Matthias Jacques started to accompany me in the narrow rooms of the historic Rubens house, over the cobbled paths in the garden, on virtual walks through the plans of the architects. While museums have often vastly improved physical accessibility, or are in the process of doing so, they often struggle with engaging people with a disability through content-driven methods. This talk is a call to arms. Research in this area is meaningful and overdue. It impacts current debates on diversity and inclusion, not just within the confines of academia and the museum world, but in society at large. To give you an example, I've given a talk on Jacques' portrait to the Belgian Organization of Amputees, a group who was riveted to find a historic poster boy for their lobbying actions. On August 29, 1624, Matthias Jacques was baptized in the Liège church of Notre-Dame-au-Fond. He was held above the famous baptismal font, surely a canonical work of art if ever there was one. One might suppose that such a well-curated start might bring only blessings further on in life, but in this particular case, that would be mistaken. I'm taking advantage of this sort of point of contact between the canonical font and the unorthodox portrait to highlight their contrasting nature. The font is justly revered and loved, an art history textbook work. The portrait, on the other hand, is, or at least was, unknown and unloved. The baptism reminds us that canons aren't just defined by what is included in them, but also very much shaped by what isn't. In that sense, defining the canon is a tricky exercise, as the act of composing it supposes many invisible acts of exclusion. In other words, it's slippery around the baptismal font, and making a canon is by definition a sin of omission. I've got a plastic, tacky and tasteless prop to make my point. As you'll discover, the foot's here to remind you of the gruesome reality of the case we'll very briefly discuss. But it is also here to remind us of something we do, so cutting off the lower limbs of art history. However natural this comes to aesthetically discerning curators, it is also a tendency which narrows our view and limits our audience relatability. Seemingly lesser objects can hold powerful stories and great historical importance. They can touch our visitors in ways a masterpiece perhaps could not. What I'm trying to say, and the pun is intended, is that we shouldn't forget about the footnotes to art history, about the misfits, the half-baked, the oddballs. Without them, the masterpieces and the canon don't make sense. Their shiny perfection can even become sterile and elitist and make it harder for people to relate to art. So I'm making a plea here for imperfection, diversity, and the unorthodox. As Rosemary Garland Thomas, one of the foremost historians of disability, noted in 2001, the history of disabled people in the Western world is in part the history of being on display, of being visually conspicuous while being politically and socially erased. Despite this observation, art historians and curators, specialists in putting things on display, have been slow to engage with the growing field of disability studies. People with a disability are still very much underrepresented in our galleries, however accessible we may have made them. The growing body of work published by social, cultural and medical historians is eye-opening, but often their studies prove sparsely, poorly and repetitively illustrated. So this is exactly where curators come in handy. Curators have a unique and important contribution to make by calling attention to a broad and diverse visual discourse on disability and to an admittedly smaller yet important group of historic representations of and by individual people with a disability. We are well equipped to sensitively interpret this material, and excitingly, we can also recover unique faces and voices from history to an in-depth knowledge of our collections. We have the facilities to display these objects and to tell their stories to large audiences. Moreover, through a curator's lens, artists' careers can be uncovered, thus making the all-important shift from a person's disabilities to her or his abilities. Rudy Eckart's 2014 exhibition Deaf, Dumb and Brilliant, Johannes Tolpa's master draftsman, for example, added a Dutch name to a growing list of rehabilitated artists such as Thomas Schweiker, Matthias Büchinger, and Sarah Biffen, whose self-portrait recently sold at auction for a multiple of its estimate. I mean, surely the record price reflects an ongoing change in society's thinking on the subject. While curators are quite confident with the aesthetic category of the imperfect or incomplete body, as seen in classical sculpture, we are much less at ease in discussing representations of people with a disability. It's simply an awkward and daunting subject. The fragmented marble Platonic ideals are so much more decorous and decorative in a museum, and at least nobody will take offense. Mark Quinn's monumental marble sculpture of a pregnant Alison Lapper on Trafalgar Square's fourth plinth in 2005 surely was a turning point. But there is so much more we can yet do, specifically in the field of old master painting. The few rare and small exhibitions that have tackled this complicated subject in recent years often did so in a collaborative effort involving specialist scholars, curators, and community activists, a sensible approach. A lot of the visual history of disability makes us very uncomfortable indeed, as this detail from Mantegna's Minerva chasing the vices from the Garden of Virtue shows. Here, a woman with a severe disability is presented as the embodiment of otium. This moralizing characterization is common in the arts of the early modern period, and its crudeness and cruelty only increase in the hands of less artists. Clearly, such hurtful images were not intended to be consumed by the people depicted in them. Bruegel's Parable of the Blind makes that point in a most obvious manner. People with a disability tend to be found at the edges of the picture plane, in a supporting role, underlining the saintliness, generosity, or beauty of others, who are more centrally positioned. Needing support themselves, they are reduced to a supporting act. In religious paintings, their condition is presented as something to be miraculously overcome, to be cured. They in themselves were often regarded as natural curiosities and collected and traded as such, as were depictions of them. From the late 17th century, a more scientific approach results in less moralizing, but more morbid depictions of people with a disability. How are we to present, discuss, and contextualize such sometimes shocking images in today's museum, in which sensitive issues of representation and inclusion are publicly played out? Matthias Jacques has learned me to be more aware, to look harder. This is a canonical portrait by Anthony van Dyck of an actual canon, Antoine de Tassis. On first or even second inspection, it isn't apparent that the subject misses his left arm. He chose to smooth over the defect. Van Dyck's colleague, the landscape painter Maarten Rijkaard, advertises his disability, which is emphatically displayed in his portrait. On a print after the same portrait, Rijkaard is described as a unimanus pictor, a one-handed painter. Similar adverse conditions were in many cases milked and marketed by artists, who in a sense displayed themselves as curiosities, an effective strategy for survival. The two portraits by Van Dyck testify to a broad spectrum of strategies of display for people with a disability. My foray into this field has been revelatory, and I've discovered several more, often unpublished portraits of people with disabilities, such as these three brothers in a museum in Namur. Collections, small and large, must hold many, many more of these stories and images, and I feel that it's our duty as curators not just to build a canon, but also to be aware of what and whom we are not including in it. Matthias Jacques lost his feet due to the negligence of his uncle, who became his legal guardian after both of Matthias' parents died of the plague. According to his uncle, Matthias drank, smoked, and frequented disreputable taverns. He was in fact locked in the municipal jail twice, escaping once. Exasperated by the antics of the teenager in his care, his uncle locked him in the basement of his riverside home over the Christmas days of 1639. The boy's feet froze and blackened as gangrene set in. Both had to be severed from his body early in 1640. The case is exceptionally well documented, as Matthias Jacques later claimed compensation for the loss of his feet in a legal case that was eventually brought before the very highest court of appeal in the Holy Roman Empire, the Reichskammergericht in Speyer. The portrait is a piece of evidence in the court case that is to convey Jacques' plight to a judge. It illustrates how the process of recovering images of people with a disability from the past can illuminate their historic emancipatory struggles. I'm currently preparing a small book on Jacques' story and on the representation of disability in early modern art, and would be very grateful to hear your ideas about this topic. My call to you as curators is this. Discuss the images of unorthodox bodies in your collection that may be painful and uncomfortable to contemporary viewers. Search for objects in your collections that shed new light on the history of disability. Try to make people who are generally reduced to a supporting role into protagonists. You are exceptionally well positioned to co-write this history, to better mirror society in your galleries, to bring to light faces, voices, and stories from the past in a way that stresses ability over disability. I am, of course, not telling you that compiling a canon is a bad thing. It is a sin of omission, not a sin of commission. A perfectly polished canon is a wonderful thing to have, and making it so is great fun. But in the process of putting shiny things on a pedestal, we must take care not to lose our footing.